time of war, but throughout our students' schooling career, throughout the time that Achanechim are with us in informal settings. But what do you do when someone says to you, why should I say Tehillim for Israeli soldiers when they're killing children on the other side? How can Israeli soldiers bomb schools? Why are nearly 2,000 Palestinians dead, only 70 Israelis? Or aren't Palestinians people too? How do you handle the difficult questions in your classroom, in your groups that you speak to informally? What do you say? We have 3 super qualified people here today who are going to discuss those questions with us. Dr. Michael Gillis on the far right, who works at the Faculty of Education and Melbourne Centre at Hebrew University. He did work in Melbourne for 7 years, about 20 years ago, and he took his family on Aliyah. Ricky Bernstein, who is a psychologist, works in Israel, and particularly in the South, who specialises in trauma. And Rabbi James Kinnard, who you know as principal of Mount Scopus College. I know each of them personally and respect them as superb Jewish educators, and anticipate that they will give you much food for thought during the discussion. When each of them have spoken for 10 minutes, or thereabouts, we'll call for questions, and we do have roving microphones, so you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, contribute to a discussion, and hopefully learn and carry on the discussion beyond this room. So first Michael Gillis will speak.
Thank you, Miriam. I think when Miriam said I'm on the far right, she was mainly referring to the seating arrangements. It's a special pleasure and honour, in a way, to say the opening words of as we begin this conference. As Miriam said, I spent 7 years here at Mount Scopus College, working here in the Jewish studies area, curriculum and other fields, they were wonderful years for us. And this building wasn't here. Our sages tell us, "Lo listakel, al tistakel ba'kankan." Don't look at the container, but look what's inside it. And from all I hear, that not only is the kankan doing well, but the content also is doing well. And it was mentioned before about the school being founded some 65 years ago, and it's frightening to think that not long after I arrived, we celebrated 40 years of Mount Scopus. So I'd like to make a few comments, even though I don't consider myself particularly qualified in a specialist sense to deal with these issues, but we live these issues, all of us, either as educators, Jewish educators in Israel, or here in Australia or elsewhere, also as parents, and as members of Jewish communities and members of the Israeli society. The first point I want to make is, I don't think an original point, but I think an important one that we have to stress to ourselves again and again, which is to make a clear distinction between hasbara, putting forward a defense of Israel, making the case for Israel, whether it's in the media or university campuses, and Israel education, educating about Israel. And quite often I've seen these two things conflated. I've been in different places in the world. I've seen the idea of, well, why don't we take our senior students and prepare them for life on the campus, prepare them to be advocates, prepare them to be hasbara people, which is a very fine objective in itself. But it seems to me that is an added layer which goes beyond our primary educational obligation, which is to cultivate in our students understanding, knowledge, understanding of nuance, of subtlety, of complexity, And on that gives them ultimately a firmer basis when they do engage in advocacy. And obviously when you're an advocate for something, you don't necessarily say everything that you know or everything that you think. So I think that distinction is very important. We always have to remind ourselves of it, particularly in a time of crisis in Hasbara, crisis of advocating for Israel that we find ourselves in at the moment. Another feature of our times is the proliferation of various forms of media. And this, I think, is a great advantage, but it also contains certain dangers. I've been in the strange situation this last few weeks where I've been on what for me is a summer sabbatical at Sydney University. And as often happens when I leave Israel, things just fall apart there. And so not long, I think maybe within days of me arriving in Australia, Israel began its ground operation in Israel, and my children, mine, were involved in it, son of a combat officer and so on. And so obviously I was very concerned, and obviously concerned about him personally. This is nothing special in Israel. It's something that people don't even talk about because it's kind of bad form, because it affects everybody. But being here, I found myself not sleeping very much at night and instead watching Israeli television on my computer. So that when I was at, say, Mount Scopus, so when I left 20 years ago, media from Israel was about, I know, getting some old Yediot Achronot from 2 weeks ago, or reading La Matchil or something in a Hebrew class. And today you can have online, immediate information. You can read every newspaper, you can watch almost every news bulletin live. And I think it's just a great advantage. We can be involved. In fact, you don't even need to live in Israel to be in Israel anymore. But there are also all the other forms of media and the social networks. And one of the things that has concerned me a little bit, things that I've heard while I've been here, is kinds of rumor which go around, which is not real news. And I think that we have to teach our students to be critical about their sources of information. And well, on the subject of being critical about sources of information, I can't remember who said it. I think it's somebody in ancient Greece, that the first casualty of war is the truth. And I think that as Israeli citizens, but I think this applies to everybody, we have to learn to be skeptical, not just about what we read in the newspapers, but perhaps even more particularly what we hear from official spokesmen of the government or the army. And it's a kind of delicate balance between being skeptical, which I think is positive, and being cynical, which is systematically disbelieving everything that's said. And again, that's not an easy thing to educate for. And particularly, I think, in times of war, we get emotional, we get caught up in things, we're looking for good news, and it takes a special effort to be reflective and stand back and say, well, is all this news we're getting, is it real news? Or all these pronouncements we're hearing accurate? Now, I think that and Miriam's opening comments really point at a reality which, if things are still similar in Australia as when I lived here, that Australia is often in a very positive sense a generation behind, maybe not a full generation anymore, in the sense that, I remember when I lived here, we'd attend a Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration in the concert hall, and there would be such enthusiasm from the audience and from the youth movements. It was something remarkable, I think, in comparison with many other diaspora communities. But I think, and I'm sure that in many ways that is still the case, but we need to be aware of new trends, of young people in our schools who they're not necessarily against Israel, but they're asking themselves questions about why does it come as a package that as a Jew I'm necessarily associated with this country, which for them is no longer this frail, it's just, in some ways it's just another country. It's a shocking thing to say. For many of them, it's been there, they don't imagine it not being there, they have no other memory, and they're beginning to ask themselves questions. Why do I have to be associated with it, particularly when the association is so often with war and with the kind of asymmetrical warfare that Israel has been engaged in so much over the last 2 decades or so. And I haven't heard all the details, but I think that there's an incident happened in South Africa which was reported on the internet in schools that I know very well, the King David schools in South Africa. I've worked with the people there and the schools there intensively over the last few years. And I don't know if you've heard about the incident where a senior student, prefect in the school, wrote on his Facebook critical words about Israel. And then the question becomes, how should the school handle this situation where the schools are strongly attached to support for Israel and Zionism? And I think there are no easy answers here in terms of values of free speech and expression of opinion. And I think that very often we'll find that it's our best students, our most sensitive students, who may be not saying the things that we like to hear, or maybe we think that they've got some wrong ideas. But how do we deal with those students? How do we cultivate them? How do we engage them? And I think that however it works out in this case in South Africa, I think it's going to be a case study that will be should be studied by all of us in thinking about this. I think what will be a growing trend among many of our young people whom we want to keep within our systems of Jewish education. We want to keep them engaged with Israel, but it's going to have to be, I think, in new ways and more subtle ways. So that's my opening comments, and perhaps there'll be further issues will come up in questions.
Good morning. It's been said that good education has 3 central pillars, elements: the cognitive, the emotional or the affective, and the ma'aseh, the behavior, the deeds. And I think that, if I take cognitive for a minute and think about the importance of historical context, which I see as a key necessary thing, and which I'm not going to address at all, aside from this single sentence. I think that it's not possible to have people make sense of what they're seeing and hearing without knowing what went before it. And so that issue of context is a responsibility that I think anyone who educates about Israel has to provide that context. I'm focusing here more on the emotional or the affective part by concentrating on the issue of the media, which Michael's already mentioned. There's a war on the ground, and there's a war going on in the media. And very often it feels like that's a war that we're losing. The media has a profound effect. It shapes how we think, it shapes how we feel. And we need to teach our students in a frontal and analytical way how to be media savvy, how to be critical consumers of what they're fed, whether it's on social media or on print or image. We need to teach them what the media is actually saying and what they are leaving out. What is it that they are not saying? And we need to be able to analyze for our students and also for ourselves what is the impact of this particular picture? What is this particular picture trying to do to its audience? Okay, what does it do to you? What does it do to me? And then we need to figure out if we want our thoughts and our beliefs to be sculpted by that emotional response to what it is that we see and what it is that we are bombarded with. Because so often there's a passive feeling, you know, being assaulted by all of these pictures. So it's important to tell the truth about deliberate choices that have been made by both sides fighting this war and the impact that those choices have on the viewer. Hamas understands and uses the power of the media in a very effective way. And since the ground operation ended and foreign journalists left the Gaza Strip, there have been a whole series of stories, and they still keep coming. Every day there's another one, where now that they're safe in their home country, foreign journalists, mostly from Europe, but also from the States and from India, have had these revelatory stories, in some cases videos that they took that they did not feel safe screening while they were in the Strip, where, you know, I don't think I need to go over them because there really have been many of them, but they have documented over and over and over. You know, when I sat down to take some notes, I had about 8 or 9 of these reports, and there have been many more since then, where things that Israel has been saying for years to very little avail about how rockets are being fired from civilian sites, from schools, from UN institutions, from hospitals, which boils down to drawing fire to civilian targets, okay? This is now documented by the foreign media, as is the ways in which they were prevented from documenting that while they were in the Strip. And they've, you know, discussed very openly the fear for their life that they had. In addition to this intimidation, there have been a few articles discussing the outright manipulation of the truth, of the facts on the scene. So, for example, a Washington Post reporter detailed the staging of an IDF attack scene that he was invited to photograph. And he was taken to photograph a mosque that had been bombed. And it discovered that someone had prepared the scene by arranging a prayer mat and some pages of the Quran which were burnt, and, you know, like set up this staged scene so that it would be photographed. And you just have to imagine the incendiary impact of that image, not just on Muslims, perhaps first on Muslims, but on you know, any thinking, feeling person. There's an anonymous report where someone explained how it really worked in Gaza. He said, interviews were granted only in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital, which is their main hospital, which is the hospital, I believe, that Israel claims to house the underground bunker that is Hamas headquarters, and this is alleged, of course. What was the reality that was created? All during the day, there were long lines of reporters waiting in the courtyard of this hospital. And the only thing to see at the courtyard is the arrival of the wounded. And that's also the only thing to take pictures of. So they're witnessing wounded people who arrive, they need treatment, and there's this impression created of a humanitarian disaster, and it's an impression that is true. But it is selective. And in terms of how selective it was, this reporter continues that they were never allowed access to any sites that were attacked by Israel that ever had any military connection. They were never allowed to photograph any fighters that were dead. They were never, none of that was captured on film. Training grants, nothing. And so the impression is that that just didn't happen. And then of course there's been this important discovery of this pamphlet, a manual, an instruction manual that argues for the greater by Hamas, that was discovered in the pocket of a fighter that was arrested, that argues for greater destruction of civilian homes and infrastructure because this increases hatred of the enemy. Okay, this increases hatred of the IDF. So it's a very deliberate and very cynical and very callous use of civilians to attract fire. But where are Israel's images? Where are our pictures? What are we doing? And I don't have a definitive answer on this, but one thing I can say is there are hardly any images of civilian injuries and deaths because this time there were very few because of the Iron Dome. And that, in a very perverse way, has worked to our detriment because we are no longer the underdog. And this is, I think, a key thing, okay, is that we are strong and we are able to protect our civilians very well. And this works against us in the international media. But even when there are casualties and even when there are deaths, Israel does not take or publish photos of blood, gore, and death. And I ask myself, why? Is this a policy? Is this censorship? Is it a matter of sensitivity to the family's privacy? Is it our desire to look strong? Is it our desire to keep the civilian population strong? And one of the answers that I found, I think, aside from censorship and an official policy, most of the other questions are part of the truth. But I was referred by a journalist to an article entitled "The Pornography of Terror." And this article, which is an article from 2008, really summarizes the attitude of the press, which is that gore and bloody pictures is a form of pornography that they're not interested in publishing. And you know, examples of that would be Shalhevet Pasuk. Well, who is it? Yeah. Okay, we don't need the examples. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I have the pleasure of spending Shabbat at our Year 9 camp, where, together with the Zionist Madrachim, we were teaching our students the answer to the question of why Israel. Why should they have a connection to Israel? And we gave them various answers. And I think that was a very good microcosm of what I think is our approach in Mount Scopus, and I think should be our approach, is to give our students the ability to make an informed choice. And we mean what we say with both those words, that it is a choice, that our students have a choice whether to support Israel, whether not to support Israel, whether to identify with Israel or whether not to. But we want to give them the information that enables that choice to be an informed one. And I make no apologies for this, we hope that they make a particular choice. We hope that they do graduate from our school with a strong connection to Israel, a strong love for Israel, but we also are well aware, as educators, we give them that choice. I very much agree with what Michael said about our job is not to create advocates. And it's interesting that we have to stand against a lot of pressure from members of the community to tell us that we should be creating advocates. And that's not what we see as our role. And to be cynical about it, we don't see that as a productive way forward. If we want to encourage young people to identify closely with Israel and have that connection with Israel. The worst way to go about that is to tell them exactly what to think. So we'd much rather they reach those very conclusions, but by other means. I would say that the nature of the connection that we want our students to have is both emotional and information-based, and the two feed on each other. In other words, we give them, at every stage of their schooling, the information about Israel that will engender that emotional connection, and we hope that that emotional connection will in turn further the desire to find out more information and to learn more. We want them to know that Israel is a real place. It's a place full of challenges, and of course the biggest and most obvious challenge is how to balance peace and security. But there are many other challenges in building a young developing state. We want our students to know that there are many different approaches to these questions. We bring in different types of speakers. We even have different viewpoints within our own faculty, which we very clearly express to our students. And we also want our students to know that Israel is theirs. It's a place which they can call their homeland. And it's a place where they can play their part, ultimately and ideally through Aliyah, but failing that through many other forms of connection, association and involvement. So how does that play out, particularly in times of war? Well, the key is information. Now, of course, one person's information is another person's hasbara, and I'm aware of that, but we think we get on the right side of the line, and we think we tell them the truth. And we're very keen to find opportunities to convey to our students the simple information about what's going on in Gaza and in the war. And as we know, and as we've heard in such detail, the media, especially in Australia, do not give a clear, balanced perspective. There is an underlying narrative behind the media reports. Israel is being identified subtly, subconsciously and consciously as a bully, as an aggressive power, as a power which is associated with violence and disproportionate response. And it's very important that we find ways to give our students a much more balanced picture, and a picture which confirms what most of us believe, but those caricatures are not true. And Israel acts in self-defense and with a high standard of morality. Nevertheless, in the fog of war, terrible things happen and people get killed. And how do we do that? Well, we do it in different age-appropriate ways. Our students themselves have prepared videos which are shown to other students and are put there on Facebook and on YouTube, which give a synopsis of the stories of what's going on. In lower levels, our educators take opportunities during the week to give updates on the news. And our emphasis at all times is not on hasbara, it is on truth. But as I said before, some people will say they're the same thing. And most crucially, our educators are available, our informal team and indeed all of our educators are available for conversations, for discussions. And it's wonderful to see that our students really are grappling with issues and engaging with issues. And our job, as I said earlier, is not to tell them what to think, but to give them the tools to help them make their own decisions. And we hope and aspire that they will make ones as Zionists, as supporters, defenders, and connected to Israel. Now, added to the information campaign is the underlying emotional campaign as well. We've had the opportunity to conduct tzedakah campaigns for soldiers, for victims. We say Tehillim, we say Tefillot, and we find our students particularly keen to connect to Israel and to connect to Jewish practice in that way. And we hope that like in our general Israel education, but in this particular time again, the emotional connection, the desire to identify with Israel, to support Israel, to feel for Israel, feeds off the information that we're giving them and creates a lens with which to view what the media is saying, with which to view current events in general. And so I hope that we have some success. I hope that we do create a generation of students who are prepared to ask questions and are able to reach whatever answers they wish, but from a position of information, able to make informed choices, able to think for themselves, and hopefully able to come to the right conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of our presenters this morning. I'm sure that many of you have questions or would like to comment very briefly. We only have 5 or 7 minutes left. There should be some roving microphones. All right, we'll use mine.
This is, I'm addressing Ricky, maybe you can help me with this. At the end of what you said, you spoke about the pornography of terror and the desire by journalists not to actually, or the decision not to expose all the blood and the gore. But that actually contradicts what we saw initially. And now that the journalists are coming out and they're telling the truth, it's almost like they're fighting a losing battle because all the impressions have already been made. Do you understand what I'm saying?
You have to produce something, and you know, I'm the article on the pornography of terror, referring to photographs of terror, was written by an Israeli, and refers to the way in which our journalists are allergic to that whole way of reporting, and they find ways around it. Okay. But, for example, there was a Merkaz Harav terror attack, and the photograph that was published was a Gemara, was a Sefer with, in a pool of blood. Okay, that was the closest, to being definitive. Okay, or when there was a baby that was killed, Shalhevet was her name, that was killed by a sniper. And her parents, this was in Hebron years ago, and her parents wanted to send the picture out internationally. And the foreign ministry refused. Not because it's their policy not to, okay? But because they just didn't want any part of it. And so the parents sent it out on their own. This was before social media was so strong. Okay, so there's that tug, there's that tension. Okay, but it boils down very much the difference between a culture of death and a culture of life, the way I like it.
My question to Rabbi Karen, especially, two things. In the last few weeks I was running in schools, talking with kids about what happened in Israel, and I found myself sometimes showing pictures of ex-leaders of Israel or head of other organizations that fought against us, but the kids didn't have any clue. I'm not going to mention which school, but in some of the schools, and I don't think we should wait till a war is happening in Israel to start to give more information. I think it should be run through the whole year about the fact, as you mentioned, the facts of the truth of our conflict, how it started. And I found that there is a lack of knowledge in some of the schools that have been of not only of what's happening now, that's very easy, as some of you mentioned, you can just log in and see everything, but what happened in the past that will give us more or less what is happening today. And I think we should use
Shlomo?
the people...
Sorry, is that a question?
The question is coming. Anyway, I think we should use the people who are experts in that, especially the shlichim, to come to school and discuss that during the year. And my question is, one of those schools, and that was a big surprise for the team, the kids were approached by the non-Jewish teachers, and some of them told them that the Israelis are killing Arabs in Gaza, and actually told them you should stop praying only just for the IDF soldiers, you should also pray for the kids in Gaza. And I'm not going to mention the school, but there was a big shock that non-Jewish school, that's something maybe also we should find. And I'd like to ask you the question, how do you deal with non-Jewish teachers? But where do you want to put them? Do you want to give them the information? Do you want to keep them away? Do you want to tell, not to discuss it with children at all? Because some of them are influenced by the media, of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Shlomo. Should we answer it? Naomi, there's someone at the back.
How long have I got?
Question too.
How long have I got?
You've got a minute.
A minute.
We have one more question.
Well, the first thing to say, I'll be very quick, in defense of my school and my colleagues, in other schools, one can't always derive from asking one or two children, or even a large number of children, exactly what they know, as to and learn from that what the school teaches. Sometimes there is a discrepancy between what we teach and what the children learn. But I would certainly agree that, of course, we should be giving them the history of Israel, knowledge of Israel, connection to Israel, I said before, and yes, that should be the knowledge of, for instance, Israel's leaders and the leaders of other countries and other forces, and of course we should be giving them that. And I'm pretty sure we are giving them that. Sometimes we have to keep trying, because sometimes they don't listen or they forget. You ask a very interesting point about the role of non-Jewish staff. And again, I certainly can't speak for other schools, but I would imagine that we all have a similar philosophy on this. In Mount Scopus, we've run sessions to provide information to the non-Jewish staff, to answer their questions, to give the perspective of what we believe to be correct, and also the perspective, and this is crucial, of the ethos of the school. Our school is a school that supports Israel. That's part of its ethos, in a critical and analytical fashion, but it's a school that supports Israel. And I think, you didn't tell me what the school is, maybe it's mine, but I think if there were members of staff who were giving messages to the students which completely undermined and was contrary to the school ethos, and any issue for that matter, that would be a matter for the school to take very seriously. But the way to avoid that is twofold. The way to avoid that is, number one, to make sure that all staff are aware of the school ethos and are comfortable with that school ethos, and if they're not comfortable, then perhaps they should be considering teaching in a different school. But also, as I said earlier, to provide information to the entire staff body, the Jewish staff, the non-Jewish staff, the Jewish studies staff, the general studies staff, so that they're all on the same page and so that they're all aware of what message the school wants to project and what message the school believes to be correct.
Thank you, Rabbi Kennard.
Coming in Israel, and they asked, I started talking to them, and they asked some very basic questions. For example, what is Gaza? Where is Gaza? What's the difference between Gaza and the West End? I'd just like to know, ask the panel, where do you think is this line between educating the context and the specific and current what's going on right now, when there are so many intricacies and there's so much complexity?
Apply. Israel education has to be, if we're talking about schooling, you have 12-year school, 5 days a week, how many weeks in the year, and it has to go on all the time. It's part of Jewish history, maybe part of studying contemporary Jewry, current events, and if that is happening in a consistent way, and Rabbi Kennard is realistic, you can talk for hours and hours that Ben Gurion was the first Prime Minister of Israel, and somebody comes and visits the class and says, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel? And the blank faces. I was away that week. So I think the answer is that this is an area, like many other areas in the curriculum, that depth of knowledge is something which is achieved over a long period of time by coming at it in a consistent and systematic way. And then when you're dealing with a time of crisis, with a particular event, there's a readiness for a deeper discussion about that event. To wait for the disastrous event, to wait for the catastrophe to begin talking about these things is obviously not a productive educational program or policy.
On your behalf, I want to thank the three panelists today. I'm sure that everybody goes away having learned something here and certainly takes away much food for thought in the future.